Ronda Rousey was once hailed as the baddest woman on the planet. She was more than just a fighter. She was a cultural phenomenon. She went from Olympic medalist to MMA superstar to Hollywood action hero almost overnight. The UFC built her into a legend, the face of women's MMA and the symbol of a revolution. But behind the highlight reels, the movie roles, and the fame, there was another story. A story the UFC didn't want fans to see. Ronda's rise was carefully manufactured. Her downfall wasn't just about two devastating knockouts, it was about favoritism, mismanagement, and a fighter who was pushed so high that when she fell, she had no way back. When Ronda entered MMA, Dana White was still publicly saying that women would never fight in the UFC. But Ronda changed his mind. She had the perfect package: Olympic bronze in judo, a fierce fighting style, charisma, and a marketable look. She wasn't just another fighter. She was a star waiting to be made. And Dana White knew it. From her very first UFC fight, the machine went into overdrive. Her armbar became her signature. She submitted opponents in seconds, fights that barely lasted long enough for fans to blink. The UFC used those quick finishes to craft her image as unstoppable. Dana White called her the greatest female athlete of all time before she had even defended her belt. Every highlight, every interview, every piece of marketing was designed to create the myth of Ronda Rousey, the unbeatable warrior. But that myth was carefully controlled. The UFC handpicked opponents who played into her strengths. Fighters like Chris Cyborg, who posed legitimate threats with power and striking, were kept at a distance. Instead, Ronda was matched with fighters who crumbled under her grappling dominance. She wasn't just being promoted, she was being protected. And it worked. Pay-per-view numbers skyrocketed. Arenas sold out. Ronda wasn't just a champion, she was a global brand. Hollywood came calling. She starred in The Expendables 3, Furious 7, and Entourage. The WWE turned her into a mainstream spectacle. Magazine covers, late-night talk shows, red carpets. Ronda was everywhere. She was marketed not just as a fighter, but as a cultural icon. But the higher the myth, the harder the fall. What fans didn't see was how much favoritism she received behind the scenes. While other fighters were forced into grueling media tours, Ronda was given special treatment. If she refused interviews or stormed out of press events, it was spun as passion. If another fighter did the same, they'd face fines. Dana White defended her relentlessly. She wasn't just a star, she was the chosen one. And that favoritism created problems. It isolated her from criticism. It shielded her from the hard truths every fighter needs to hear. Instead of addressing her weaknesses, she was told she didn't have any. Her coach, Edmond Tarverdyan, famously fed her false confidence, insisting she was a world-class boxer when in reality her striking defense was almost non-existent. Surrounded by yes-men and protected by the UFC machine, she stopped evolving as a fighter. And in MMA, if you stop evolving, you're already falling behind. The fall came in November 2015 at UFC 193 in Melbourne, Australia. Ronda faced Holly Holm in what was marketed as her biggest fight yet. The event broke records, with over 56,000 fans in attendance. The UFC marketed it like a coronation. But Holm had studied Ronda for years. While Ronda rushed forward recklessly, Holm stayed calm, using her boxing and footwork to punish her. The aura of invincibility vanished. Then came the head kick heard around the world, a perfectly timed strike that knocked Ronda out cold. The myth collapsed in front of millions. The loss was brutal, but the aftermath was even more devastating. Ronda disappeared from the spotlight. Behind closed doors, she was broken. Months later, she admitted in an emotional interview on The Ellen DeGeneres Show that she sat in the hospital after the fight and thought about suicide. For the first time, the invincible image cracked. Fans saw not the baddest woman on the planet, but a deeply human, deeply vulnerable woman struggling with pain. Her depression didn't just come from losing a fight. It was tied to deeper trauma. When Ronda was only 8 years old, her father committed suicide. That tragedy left scars she carried for the rest of her life. Fighting had always been her way of coping with pain, her outlet for grief and anger. But when home shattered her aura, that old trauma came flooding back. She wasn't just dealing with defeat, she was dealing with the collapse of the identity she built to survive. The UFC didn't know how to handle this. There was no mental health campaign, no official statement from Dana White about her struggles. Instead, the UFC allowed her to disappear. Other fighters who lost were forced into press conferences, grilled by reporters, made to explain themselves. Ronda was shielded from all of it. For anyone else, it would have been unacceptable. For Ronda, it was image control. The UFC wanted to protect the brand, even as the fighter was falling apart. When she returned in December 2016 at UFC 207, the UFC promoted it as her grand redemption. She was placed against Amanda Nunes, the reigning champion. But all the marketing was about Ronda. Her face was on posters, commercials, and billboards, while Nunes was treated like an afterthought. But inside the cage, the reality was undeniable. From the opening bell, Nunes dominated. Her punches landed clean, over and over. Ronda looked helpless. In just 48 seconds, it was over. She hadn't thrown a meaningful strike. The myth was destroyed beyond repair. And then came silence. No farewell fight, no press conference, no statement from Dana White. The UFC machine that once treated her as untouchable simply moved on. Her legacy wasn't celebrated the way Georges St-Pierre, Anderson Silva, or other legends were. She wasn't inducted into the Hall of Fame. She wasn't even mentioned often. It was as if she had been erased. But Ronda didn't disappear entirely. She resurfaced in WWE. To some, it seemed strange, the most feared woman in MMA turning to scripted entertainment. But for Ronda, it made sense. Wrestling gave her control over her story. In WWE, the outcomes were predetermined, the narratives crafted. She headlined WrestleMania, won titles, and was celebrated by fans once again. It was a rebirth, but to critics, it looked like an escape, leaving the real fight world behind the moment she could no longer dominate. The UFC barely acknowledged her transition. They avoided replaying her highlights. They avoided celebrating her impact. By not talking about her, they avoided reminding fans of Holmes' head kick or Nunes's destruction. It was deliberate. The UFC buried her legacy to protect its own image. But the truth is undeniable. Ronda Rousey changed everything. She was the reason Dana White reversed his stance on women's MMA. She proved that women could sell pay-per-views, fill arenas, and headline cards. Without her, the careers of fighters like Amanda Nunes, Valentina Shevchenko, and Rose Namajunas might never have been possible on the scale we see today. Ronda legitimized women's MMA and carried the sport into the mainstream.